Today's episode of the Gone Fission Nuclear Report is brought to you by Fluor. We're building a better world. Welcome to the Gone Fission Nuclear Report. Your one-stop source for all the latest news from the Department of Energy's Environmental Management Program. Now, here's your host, Michael Butler.
Hello, and welcome to the Gone Fission Nuclear Report. Today is Monday, January 29th, 2024. We're covering all the news from the Department of Energy's Environmental Management Program across the country. We thank our friends at Fluor for being presenting sponsor of today's episode. The Department of Energy is one of the largest federal civilian contracting agencies, awarding contracts for research, weapons production, and environmental cleanup. The cleanup jobs are huge and expensive. The contracts are multi-year and worth billions of dollars. The case in point is the demolition of the Oak Ridge gaseous diffusion plant, the first ever teardown of a complete gaseous diffusion complex anywhere in the world. In the earliest days, contractors performed their work as a patriotic duty. DuPont, which operated the Savannah River plant for 35 years during the Cold War, received a fee of $1 per year in addition to its costs. Union Carbide, a company not known for its nuclear involvement, managed the Atomic Energy Commission's facilities in Oak Ridge. That's all changed now as contractors earn millions of dollars in fees at DOE sites around the country. The big companies that compete for these contracts are small in number, but well known. They include our podcast sponsor, Fluor, Amenum, Bechtel, Jacobs, BWXT, Atkins, Honeywell, Huntington Ingalls, and others. In today's episode, we're going to examine the process that DOE uses to select contractors for multi-year, multi-billion-dollar environmental cleanup contracts.
We're looking for performance in similar scopes of work, whether it be with key personnel or with the companies themselves, that they've been there, they've done it well. We have bent over backwards lately. I think Aaron's alluded to it, in really trying to change up our RFPs to take out the unspoken bias, if you will, towards DOE experience and DOE site experience where that contract's going to be held. And so there are other contracts out there. There's other projects that are very similar to our work. And so we've tried to open it up a bit to where that can score at the same as a DOE facility.
We'll be back with more right after this from Fluor. The DOE procurement process has evolved over the years from an initial cost plus fixed fee arrangement to today's indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity model. Through all its iterations, the process has required extensive communication between the agency and the contractor. Some of the most important methods of communication include draft solicitations that allow interested parties to review the draft request for proposals and provide comments, ask questions, and offer suggested changes or other feedback before the government issues the formal solicitation. Industry Day events allow DOE to explain its programmatic needs and mission requirements and agency officials may solicit questions and input from industry. Such events also present an opportunity for small business representatives to meet representatives from larger entities to facilitate potential subcontracting opportunities. Pre-solicitation conferences allow DOE to explain the particulars of specific acquisitions, including anticipated milestones, as well as solicit questions and input. These conferences are especially useful when conducted following the release of a draft solicitation. Pre-proposal conferences present an opportunity for industry entities to obtain clarification and provide feedback on elements of the solicitation to help ensure that DOE receives high-quality offers. And finally, one-on-one meetings between DOE and officials from a single entity allow for direct communication, given industry reluctance to share information in a public forum for fear of losing competitive advantage. Winners are chosen on the basis of several important criteria, including price, past performance, key personnel, proposed organization, technical approach, environment and safety approach, and small business participation. And because the stakes are high in both industry reputation and financial reward, the bid process is highly competitive. As an example, last July, DOE awarded a contract to an Minim-led team of Fluor and Cavendish Nuclear for cleanup of the Portsmouth site in Ohio. It is a contract valued at nearly $6 billion over 10 years. Often when contracts are awarded, the competition heats up to a higher degree when the loser protests. A case is currently in court, filed when an Atkins-led group took the highly unusual step of bypassing Government Accountability Office review and taking its appeal directly to federal court. In today's episode, we'll learn more about the DOE procurement process in a conversation with two top agency officials. We'll talk with Angela Watmore, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Acquisition, and Aaron Deckard, Procurement Director in EM's Consolidated Business Center. We'll have that right after this from Fluor. Our guests today are Angela Watmore, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Acquisition and Project Management at DOE, and Aaron Deckard, Procurement Director at EM's Consolidated Business Center. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here, Michael.
Well, we're glad to have you here today. We're talking about EM's procurement program today. And I'd like to start by just asking you, Angela, why does DOE use a contractor method for doing the cleanup work as opposed to direct DOE employees?
Well, we do have some government-owned, government-operated sites, but for the majority of the part, we are the largest civilian agency out there and use contractors. And I think the reason being is that it's typically more cost effective, and we get the best value. We get a bigger, broader talent pool for finite durations that allow us to deal with surge capacity, unique capacity requirements. And I think the contractors in general have a smaller long-term cost as compared to government employees on the back end. So there's a lot of flexibility with a contractor workforce that we believe is in the taxpayer's best interest.
Well, the contracting program has certainly changed a lot over the years. I know if you look back to the 1950s, for example, when the Savannah River plant then was built and operated by DuPont, DuPont operated that facility for a fee of $1 per year. There was a certain patriotic aspect to their involvement there. Union Carbide operated not known as a nuclear company, operated Oak Ridge. Of course, they didn't do it for $1 a year, but there was a sort of a different mode in the early days than you find in the DOE contracting program today. Can you comment on that?
Sure. I mean, we don't have dollar contracts really anymore. I think that was a time in history during a world war where we were trying to get first to develop a first of kind research facility. And I think at that time too, it was debatable on should research and development first of kind facilities deserve a profit. I think where we've matured to now, in these communities that we've embedded ourselves in, that profit now that is looked at, and it does match the scope of work typically, the amount of fee that the company is going to make, and risk acceptance on the contractor's part. And I think the intent and some of the requirements we have in our RFPs right now is for that fee then to be pushed back into the communities that we do work in. And also pushed for incentives for the workforce that perform the work. So it is a way of making the policy work in a holistic way. It's not that we couldn't look at something like that again, but we'd have to look at it in totality because we have become accustomed then to having our contractors give back into our communities and to the workforce. Aaron, did you have anything you wanted to add on that?
I would add this. Part of it, you have to really understand our history and our mission as to why we're structured the way we are today. One thing, and that really goes back to the Manhattan Project through the Cold War. And then when our cleanup program started in 1989, we had 107 sites. So we're now down to 15. We've closed 92 sites. That's part of the reason to have the contractor workforce and the structure we have as contractors can be a little more nimble as we move toward ultimate closure at each site.
You've moved in the past few years from the traditional M&O contract management and operations to the new IDIQ model. Why did you do that? And can you contrast the old way of doing business with the M&O versus how you're doing business now with these indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts?
Sure. I mean, the M&O contracts were fairly arm's length contracts and general scopes of work. We're at the point now with our cleanup program, and managing cost and schedule, especially on some of our capital projects, as well as D&D and soil cleanup, same thing with groundwater cleanup, that we were trying to get to a place where we could define a particular scope of work with an end state. We had closed down Rocky Flats, Mound, Fernald. We didn't really have any big sites that were right at the tipping point of closure. But through our federal life cycle baselines and the way we were chunking work down and planning it out, there were end states that could be achieved, and we could attach a specific risk reduction and environmental liability retirement to that scope of work. And so I think that the move to IDIQ is working well for us. Some of the benefits that we've encountered is that we do have better defined scopes of work. We have better partnering right off the bat. We don't have adversarial negotiations going on immediately at contract transition because of material changes in the scope of work, because it's taken 2 years or longer to award the contract and the work has changed since what went into the contract type. The other area that I think that we're seeing positiveness is less change orders, because we've done better defined scopes of work and match that up with an appropriate contract type for each task order. we're seeing less changes. And that's of benefit as well. I think the transparency that we've shown post-award with partnering with our contractor and working with our regulators has also allowed us to really sit down at the table post-award and talk through the technologies, because we're at the tail end of some of the hardest cleanup left in the program. And so we do want to make sure that we have the right technologies, the most recent technologies looked at, and most cost-effective way of tackling these waste streams.
Well, you use in the new method, you use task orders now.
Correct.
Over a 10-year period of the contract, there could be multiple task orders, and those are developed as the need for work is identified. Can you talk a little bit more about that, how the task orders work?
So what happens at the beginning is we have a 10-year task order strategy that the sites put together based upon our federal life cycle estimates. And that scope of work then with a defined end state is chunked down. And that scope of work through the partnering process, we'll talk through the scope of work with the contractor that's now on board, make sure that the assumptions that we put into our federal life cycle baseline get a QA, talk about that, see if there's other ideas, see if the assumptions are still sound, see if the contractor has new ideas that may not have been thought of in our assumptions, or a different technology perhaps, and ways to work with the regulators with our milestones that we're legally required to meet.
The procurement process, let's talk through how that works now as it exists today. You have several steps that you go through. There's a draft RFP, companies make expressions of interest, and there's a lot of communication that goes on between DOE and the contractor now as in terms of working through the contract award process. Can you talk a little bit about just how the process works from start to finish?
Yeah, Michael, that's a great question. As the procurement process is a very complex process from start to finish. I will tell you that EM has genuinely worked for a number of years to increase what I would say is the predictability of our processes and we've done that not only with our internal staff, but also with our external industry partners. That includes transparent discussions with industry, both during and after each individual procurement, in order to make sure that we are continuously improving our processes to the extent we can. Specifically, we've worked diligently in terms of our processes and also our people to build as effective and repeatable of a process as we can. A few particular things that I would note. So for awareness, we centralized our pre-award process for major procurements at our EM Consolidated Business Center here in Cincinnati in the mid-2010s. And what that's done is it's really helped us in terms of standardization and consistency from one procurement to the next. Another thing we implemented in the last 5 years was what we call an acquisition core, CORPS core. That's a group of individuals at EMCBC. They effectively serve as chairpersons and voting members on major source selections. And that's helped us further improve that repeatability and consistency from one procurement to the next. To make sure I answer your question from a nuts and bolts process standpoint, in general, we begin with any procurement with a market research and an acquisition planning phase. As you alluded to, that often begins with some sort of sources sought or request for information. I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you that genuinely one of our initial focus areas always is on small business capabilities and potential set-aside opportunities, whether that's a total small business set-aside or potentially a further socioeconomic set-aside. After that, we finalize an acquisition plan. We move generally into a draft, a solicitation, or request for proposal. After that, we engage again with industry to gather further information that may be in the form of a pre-solicitation conference, move toward a final RFP, receive and evaluate proposals, and then we ultimately award a contract. I will say overall, in the past 5 years or so, EM has made significant positive strides, and I've heard this from industry as well. Don't get me wrong, we still have further improvements that we can make, but we've made a number of positive strides in terms of our consistency and repeatability of our solicitation and evaluation processes from start to finish.
I think one of the things that strikes people is the limited number of companies that are qualified and that actually participate in the EM cleanup program. You can probably count those companies on two hands. What are the minimum qualifications when you look at the companies that are out there to do cleanup work or to lead the cleanup at different sites? What are the minimum qualifications that you see that these companies need?
Yeah, minimum qualifications, I don't want to lead us down a path that say there's a minimum bar. I mean, each procurement is going to speak for itself and what we're looking for. But I think in general, these contracts, these major facility contracts are a 90 plus incumbent workforce capture. So you have to really ask, what are we buying? If the workforce is just going to roll over to the new contractors. So, we're buying a corporate backreach and a management team. And so, in general, we're looking for performance in similar scopes of work, whether it be with key personnel or with the companies themselves, that they've been there, they've done it well. We have bent over backwards lately. I think Aaron's alluded to it, in really trying to change up our RFPs to take out the unspoken bias, if you will, towards DOE experience and DOE site experience where that contract's going to be held. And so there are other contracts out there. There's other projects that are very similar to our work. And so we've tried to open it up a bit to where that can score at the same as a DOE facility.
I would add that this has also been a focus of Congress even in the past couple of years, and it really tied into actions we were already taking. We have truthfully and sincerely tried to open the aperture on RFPs to be as open as possible to not only a fair competition, but also to companies that may not be, I'll say, traditional players in our EM market. So this is a topic that we're aware of, and we've intentionally tried to address this concept of qualifications for folks that may be well versed in similar work in other markets. They may just not have worked in the EM market previously.
Let me jump ahead to one question that I actually had planned for later, since we're on this topic. How important is it, or is it important in your deliberations to keep what limited players there are in the game? When you think about awarding contracts, do you want to try to be as even-handed as you can and make sure everybody gets a piece of the pie and gets some work, or does that enter into your thoughts and deliberations at all?
So during the procurement process and the award of a contract, the answer would be no. There's no hidden even-handedness concept going on. I mean, we are really driven by Section M and making a best value determination. Now, if you go up front ahead of actually releasing an RFP, there is a lot of thought on having a robust industry base, not only with large businesses, but small businesses as well. So there are internal discussions on carving out scopes of work for small businesses and trying to match that up as well. We want a healthy, robust industry base and competition. And that's really the focus, but it's really thought about much more upfront in the process.
You value communication in the procurement process, communication between DOE and the contractor community. You provide a lot of opportunities for that through the meetings that you have with the contractors, industry day, on-site visits, a lot of other things that we can talk about. But how important is communication in the procurement process? When you ask for and solicit contractor input, how seriously do you take the information that you get from the contractors as you go forward?
Michael, that's another good question. So I'll touch on this from three perspectives. So first of all, first off, overall, the feedback is incredibly important on many levels. A few examples. So within the context of each individual procurement, we get feedback at least generally at two phases, during the initial market research phase and then in what I'll say the RFP phase. I will tell you that feedback we take it seriously. Each of our procurement teams receives that input and at least considers and adjudicates every single comment that comes back from industry. So every piece of feedback we receive, we consider. Two other things I'll point to is last year we conducted our first ever on the EM side, our first ever reverse industry day. We held that session in March. That was very insightful. We heard from industry on two separate panels, just in terms of giving us an opportunity to do less talking and more listening. So that was insightful, and we're actually now in the process of planning for our second reverse industry day. That at least initially we're looking at having more of a small business focused second reverse industry day. And I would pivot to my third sort of example I'll offer you is that hearing from the small business community is incredibly important. And I can tell you, I myself have sat in on a number of one-on-ones where, say this is a major procurement and it's a very small business that may be coming in to meet with us. And perhaps that small business is a little intimidated or shy to come meet with DOE and may say, hey, I'm a really small company. You may not be interested in what I have to say because this is a really large contract that you're bidding. It's quite the opposite. And in fact, we spend a lot of time on our side crafting and writing specific contract terms and provisions that are aimed to grow the small business community in our market. And hearing from those companies is important because we need to hear that feedback and make sure that time and effort that goes into writing those small business clauses, if you will, that encourage small business participation. We need to make sure they're working and they're having their intended consequence. So just a few examples that I could give you that would, I think, demonstrate how critically important that industry feedback is to our process.
You use the term reverse industry day for our viewers and listeners who may not be familiar with that. Can you just say exactly what reverse industry day is?
So a reverse industry day, in short, we often hold industry days for our major contracts, or we sometimes do, I'll say, at the beginning of the process to invite the contractors on site, share a little bit about the requirement, and then enable a dialogue. But it's a little bit more of us sharing information with the industry group. This is the opposite. So it's something that a number of other federal agencies have done. We partnered with Professional Services Council for last year's session. So it was an opportunity for us to listen. We did not have a formal speaking role. It was rather two panels of industry representatives sharing feedback to the department or to EM on our procurement processes in terms of areas, comments and suggestions and areas where we can improve. We then turned around and we made what I'll say is a commitment back to industry about a month later to share, to really, in my opinion, demonstrate that we were listening and share back what our commitment was. For example, we shared a commitment. Industry said, hey, when you put out an RFI, we need enough time to respond, really about 3 weeks or so. So in our commitment back, we said, okay, for any RFIs we put out after this session for market research, we will commit to you that we will have every intention to allow at least 21 days for a response. And we've done that since then. So it was a really valuable session for us just to hear specific concerns or suggestions from our industry partners.
Well, let's talk about protests for a minute. To the casual observer, it would almost seem like every or nearly every contract that's awarded is protested. I'd like to know, first of all, is that the case? And what is the record for protests? And how many are successful? Tell us about the protest process, how that works, and what does it do to clean up schedules?
I can take that one as well. Another insightful question. I will tell you, this is something we take very seriously. Not every award is protested. Sometimes it feels like that. That's not the case. To be truthful and transparent, we first and foremost, above anything else, believe in a fair competition. We also do prefer to avoid protests to the extent possible, no question. And to be as open as I can, we think about this a lot internally, and we do everything possible throughout the process to ensure an equitable competition, consistent evaluation of all offers. When we hold a debriefing at the conclusion, we intend to provide as much valuable feedback as we possibly can, which ideally would be factors to help us avoid a protest. That being said, we do recognize that protests are a statutory check and balance in the process. They can take on a number of forms, either to the agency, to the GAO, or potentially to the COFC. Your question, you mentioned sort of a perception sometimes that every award is protested. That's not exactly the case, but I can speak a little bit in terms of our specific statistics in terms of protests. So our protest statistics are favorable in relation to government-wide averages, certainly. We do closely track our protest statistics. In terms of our major awards, fewer than half of our major awards are protested. Far less than half of those protests are effective for any sort of corrective action. And since our pre-award process shifted to EMCBC in the mid-2010s, I believe, to my knowledge, there's only been one sustained protest in about the past decade. From a practical standpoint, a programmatic or a project standpoint, protests can be disruptful, certainly. At a minimum, they can disrupt the planned timing of a transition. They can have an impact on cleanup timelines. As the contract, and just from a workforce standpoint, which I think came up earlier in the discussion, can be a time of, I'll say, uncertainty or heightened stress for the incumbent workforce that it would be planning to move from one contract to the next. So again, it's something that we take very seriously. We have a strong preference to avoid protests whenever possible, not only for the department's sake, but also for industry considerations, whether it's the winning offer that happened to be the successful awardee that has a strong desire to transition the contract, or whether it's the key persons that have been proposed and committed to that procurement through the duration. We don't want to lengthen that time for those key personnel any longer than we otherwise need to.
Angela, these companies spend millions of dollars in bidding on the contracts. A lot of time and effort and money goes into it on the part of each and every one of them. You spoke at the nuclear cleanup workshop in September last year, and on a panel, and I took some notes, and I think one of the things you said there was that you were trying to reduce the time frame that is required now for companies to recoup their investment. And I thought you said from 5 years down to 5 months, but I may have my notes wrong on that. But I'd like you to comment on that if you can, how important it is to DOE to help companies recover the costs that they invest in pursuing these contracts.
Yeah, so I don't recall mentioning a time frame for recouping proposal costs. I do recall stating, when we moved from the contract type that we were doing, a 5 + 5 years, to the IDIQ method, one of the things we were trying to tackle was the price of entry into the DOE market. Lowering that price of entry would benefit not only our current industry partners, but allow new entrants to come in. Some of these proposals were costing anywhere from $5 to $10 million. Evaluating proposals, it's a resource-intensive effort, not only on the industry side, but on the government side. And keep in mind, it ties in with the protest question earlier, these are government resources. Taxpayer dollars are paying for these government resources. So we want to ensure the expenditure of the government resources is in the best interest of the taxpayer. So you have to ask yourself, what's the minimum amount of information that we would need to make a best value determination versus asking for things that may or may not carry over into execution space. I think the other area that I think maybe got crossed over here was the cost of capital to start up these LLCs and trying to tackle that animal as well. It's hundreds of millions of dollars out of pocket of these companies. And so we've looked at different ways to allow that investment, the investment into the joint venture to pay those salaries right off the bat. How can we get that return on investment back quicker to the industry? And so we've done a lot of different things. Number one, shortening the invoice payment cycle down. And then another one is allowing provisional fee allowances at a more frequent, higher rate.
Okay, when you're looking at proposals, I'd like to talk about two areas that I think you consider to be very important and have you comment on their importance. One is the involvement of small business, and Aaron, you've touched on that some already. And how important is it to DOE that the lead contractor include small business participation in their proposal? And secondly, the value of key personnel, the key personnel that these companies propose, they try to bring in their best and brightest to run the operations. And how hard do you look at that when you're evaluating a proposal?
Great question. I'll speak to the first part on small business and procurement equity, and I'll turn it to Angela to talk through the key personnel piece. So in terms of small business and procurement equity, love the question. Small business outreach and inclusion and procurement equity are topics that we feel very passionately about, to be sure. In recent years, we've made significant efforts and strides in both areas. In particular, we focused on the socioeconomic categories, including the small disadvantaged businesses and other socioeconomic and traditionally underserved businesses. We've also focused in terms of small business in doing whatever we can in expanding the supplier base. Part of that we've really taken to heart is the piece on expanded outreach. So just a few examples includes, but is not limited to, a close partnership with our ATIBA partners. We launched what we termed or coined a Small Business Thursday concept at the 2022 ATIBA BOTC conference in the fall. That included panels as well as matchmaking sessions. Continued that this past fall as a second annual event, incredibly successful, very positive outcome in terms of matchmaking, not just with the department and federal entities, but also with our prime contractors. We're moving toward this March at our waste management conference. We'll have a matchmaking session on Thursday morning. I mentioned our reverse industry day that we held last May, initial planning session for our second reverse industry day. Again, like I shared, our initial thinking is that we want to focus that more on small business. We had a presence at the OSDBU, a big DOE small business office at their conference last summer. We'll have a presence at the 8A conference here coming up in February 2024. So we've done as much as we can in terms of outreach. That being said, we are more than open to any suggestions or ideas for how we can further expand that outreach and target that outreach to those companies that may be looking to enter our market. For those, just from a big picture standpoint, for those not aware, DOE has a small business first policy. It's a very concise policy. It's something we take very seriously, and we do have every intent to create as dynamic of a business environment as possible for the small business community. You mentioned small business inclusion in terms of our procurement process. For any contract that is not set aside for small business participation and inclusion is at least a component within the evaluation and the selection process. For our largest contracts, it's generally part of the management approach factor. So that's the pre-award piece. So both pre-award and post-award, we're doing everything we possibly can to bring those companies into the fold, whether it's at the prime level or potentially at the subcontract level. I'll leave it with this on this topic, and I hope this is coming through in my thoughts, but we are engaged, we're listening, and we're being as responsive as we can to our small business community. And really trying to hear from them what those barriers are so that we can grow to the extent possible from a procurement equity standpoint. And with that, Angela, I'll turn it over to you to speak through the key personnel piece.
Sure. The importance of the key personnel is critical. It's extremely important. Lately in our acquisitions, it's the number one factor that we're evaluating. And if you remember when I answered one of the questions earlier, I talked about that incumbent workforce capture that happens on most of our large facility contracts. So really what we're buying is that management team coming in. So it's important that team works well together. The makeup of the management team is just as important as the individual itself. So we do look at the rationale for why the team was put together, why certain positions, even if we didn't require it as key, why the offer is offering it up as a key position, and what makes sense. I think to the level that we evaluate the resumes of these key personnel, we also do oral interviews now and problem scenarios often, just to see how that team works together, because that's what we're going to be interfacing with in our partnering.
Procurement is a long-term process. It takes months. And how long does it take now to get from the draft RFP to the contract award typically, and then through transition? What kind of a time frame are you looking at between the start of the process and the time the contractor actually shows up on site?
Another great question. You're certainly correct that major procurements are a long-term process. This is an area where we're continuously looking to improve. As I mentioned earlier, when the pre-award function moved to EMCBC in the mid-2010s, that allowed us to really lock in on a process and focus on areas where we can not only shorten the time frame, but at a minimum be more consistent in the time frame. And we do understand that not only on the EM side, trust me, our EM leadership has a desire for predictable timelines. Our site customers do. And we also understand that industry has a desire for predictable timelines. So again, we've worked hard to gain traction in this area, especially for our large competitive procurements, where, to be honest, there can be a number of variables in the process, some of which could be the number of proposals we receive, the quality of the proposals, and so forth. With this said, through the process, we all have to understand that the critically important outcome that we're trying to reach and we need to reach is to reach the best possible decision, a defensible decision, and the decision that's advantageous for the department for both the EM enterprise and the taxpayer. These are very large, complex, critically important projects and contracts. In terms of specific timelines, we're now to the point where we're generally 12 months or less from final RFP to contract award. That's really the best barometer I can give. We're generally about 3 months from draft RFP to final RFP. So if you want to go draft RFP to contract award, it's generally 15 months or less. That being said, the competitive procurement process is very complex, many steps along the way, especially for the large contracts. Just to touch on a few of the things we've covered earlier, along the way, there are steps, and this does take a little additional time through the process, but I think it is value added, the steps to engage with our industry partners through the process. And in order to have that substantive engagement, it does take a little bit of time to gather that feedback. The question you asked earlier in terms of protests, that's another factor here. Protests in general do not speed up the process, but rather, in order to make sure that we make an award that's as defensible as possible, that sometimes does take a little extra time to make sure that when we make that contract award, we are absolutely positive that it's a fair outcome, it's an objective outcome, and then it reaches an award decision that's in the best interest of the department. A few specific examples of things we've done in recent years to gain efficiencies in our process. Angela touched on our move to the IDIQ end state contracting model. That has resulted in some efficiencies from a time and a cost standpoint in both the proposal cost for industry as well as the evaluation process on the department side. So that's helped in terms of the predictability of our timelines. We've also achieved greater repetition here at CBC. I believe to our industry partners, they see now a more consistent process from start to finish. And the other thing we've really tried to genuinely do is to place a significant focus on continuous improvement as a whole for the procurement process. We sincerely consider ourselves to be a learning organization. We have a desire to shorten that process where we can, but also ensuring that we maintain a high level of quality and defensibility as we work through the process.
Well, my final question I'd like for both of you to comment on this, if you would. What do you see now as the major challenges are for procurement as you look at across the DOE system? We've gone from the 107 original sites down to about 15 sites now in the EM program, and some of these sites they're very challenging in themselves, like Hanford, which still has decades of work left to do, which means a lot more contracting. What are your biggest challenges that you face now, and how do you feel that EM is prepared to handle those challenges? Angela, let's start with you, if you don't mind.
Sure. I think, our biggest challenge in doing the procurements per se is finding key discriminators. I think you led off earlier with our industry base is fairly small that have done this a lot. And we're at the tail end now of some of the hardest parts of the cleanup and some of the most highly radioactive high-level waste. I think that, our long-term industry base, they've got the projects and key personnel that cover the PWS. So we have to find ways through the procurement process to really find these discriminators to say this is going to be the best partner that we can get, and bring them to the table. And this is the critical thinkers that we want to think through these solutions and these complex technical challenges. We're going through an effort right now with our federal life cycle baselines to just reanalyze the assumptions in there. And is this the right technology still today? From when we did this analysis years ago, and really taking a hard look at that. I think EM's doing a good job of doing this. There's always room for improvement. I think, the subjectivity of our board members, like I mentioned before, a bias towards similar work at DOE facilities. We've really tried to chip away at that through changes in our RFP and education of our SEB members and how to critically think through the analogous experience at, say, a chem-D mill plant versus a DOE plant, analogous safety experience. I think growing the key personnel pool is another challenge for us. We're looking for that right blend of new ideas, but experience as well. And I think that we might have to take a look at potentially paying for deputy PMs to help grow that successive pipeline. The other challenge I think that we have, and Aaron, you can talk a little bit more about this as well, but is holding the contractors accountable for what they promised us in their initial offer. Before we were doing the end state contracting models, we were getting a full technical approach with assumptions and then, having to do major true ups afterwards. And being able to get to the table now and have a discussion early on before we give them the scope of work to price out is a way that we can hold them to the offer with limited change orders. Over to you, Aaron.
Yeah, that's a great bridge into really speak a little post-award. So you mentioned what are some of the significant challenges? Angela talked through some of the pre-award items. Post-award, we have 15 sites left. We've identified 9 projects under the end state sites or projects under the end state contracting model. We have 7 of those contracts awarded and through any potential protests. We have 2 others that are ongoing at Hanford and West Valley. So really some of the onus is moving toward post-award. These are long contracts. These have IDIQ contracts, 10-year ordering period with the ability to order for 5 additional years. So it could be a relationship that lasts up to 15 years. Partnering is absolutely critical. And we've seen that be really successful on the post-award side, which really partnering was one of the key tenets of the end state contracting model as we launched off on this endeavor. So I think that partnership post-award, having the requirements definition, the reliable pricing, having a willingness to have a partner that's going to bring the necessary parties to the table. Maybe that's through subcontracting. We've written language into recent RFPs that requires our contracts to bring new ideas and new solutions to the table to advance the mission on that particular project. And that's the idea, is to hold the contractor accountable once we identify those those task orders place them. We really have, I would spin a challenge into an opportunity. We really have a significant opportunity under the end state contracting model to significantly advance the mission, ultimately toward closure at a number of sites. For example, we have an end state contracting or an end state contract in Moab that will take us through closure. We recently awarded Ports D&D. At Savannah River, for example, significant site. We just recently placed 2 large task orders. They're 8-year task orders. That'll push us toward, as planned, potentially closing the tanks at Savannah River by 2037, which would be a significant accomplishment. So while there are challenges, there are also significant opportunities with the right level of partnering and the right task orders to advance the EM mission at many of our sites.
Well, Angela Watmore, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Acquisition and Project Management, and Aaron Deckard, Procurement Director at EM's Consolidated Business Center. I want to thank you for participating in the podcast today. It's been a very, very informative session, and I feel like you've given us some good insight into how the process works and what we can expect in the years ahead. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
Today's episode of the Gone Fission Nuclear Report is brought to you by Fluor. We're building a better world.